Eric Tymoigne, thank you so much for joining me on SCOTONOMICS.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we're having this conversation on the morning of the 5th of November, which is, of course, election day in the USA. So before we get into MMT and all the details, I just thought it'd be really interesting to get your views on what you think is likely to happen today and over the next week, and what kind of impact do you think this huge decision will have on the American economy?
So yes, this is quite a stressful day today. I'm going to be in Washington, D.C. actually in 2 days. So if Trump doesn't get elected, there might be quite a scene there. Well, we'll see. But overall, yes, it's if we have Trump, there are significant consequences for the United States and for the world in general. In terms of environmental policy, in terms of foreign policy, in terms of internal domestic policies also. And given that what he has stated in terms of how he would manage the first few days after the election, it's very worrisome. He wants to put people in prison. He wants to investigate people. That's crazy. On the other side, Harris too has her own baggage. The war in Gaza is a main problem there. I think there is gonna be. If she wins, there will also be instability in the sense of the fact that, well, will the other side acknowledge her victory? And I highly doubt it. So we are in uncertain territory either ways, basically.
Yeah. Well, I mean, who do you think better understands MMT in this kind of descriptive part of of modern monetary theory around monetary operations and the importance or not of the fiscal deficit?
We have Ocasio-Cortez that basically embraced MMT. Okay, and so she has, I think, a good understanding of what this is all about. Stephanie Kelton worked for Bernie Sanders. Now he has, I think he still works in the traditional framework, and I don't think will explicitly endorse MMT, but he understands how to use that to work with the government, within the government, how to frame things, how to debate things within the government. So we have an ally there. Now, on the Trump side, when he was president, he did say that deficits don't matter. We can issue the money too. So now I don't know if we can trust what he says, because his thoughts change every minute or every second too. And he basically follow the wind and whatever is the most convenient for him at the time. He did make those statements, but it's just very superficial, I think. We have to look more for the progressive left. For some people are willing to take the argument seriously and work with it, basically, either explicitly when framing issues, when talking to the public, or more within the government and understanding what can be done there.
I think that's what you've set up in the chapter that you've written in the Elgar Companion to Modern Monetary Theory, which has just been published this year. And I think that's kind of, you're looking to see how MMT can help frame our economic and political choices. Is that a fair summary of that chapter?
Yes. Okay. Because ultimately, I think that's maybe something that is kind of paradoxical among MMT. We spend a lot of time on the financial side of things, trying to explain the nitty-gritty, the institutional aspect of government finance, to ultimately say that all this is irrelevant.
Yes.
And that really the focus of attention should not be there. Because that's not what matters. What matters ultimately is how you make policy. And so the question becomes that Now that we know that finding the money is not a problem, okay, how does that impact the way you make policy and how you frame debates, how you discuss issues, how you look at the problem and try to find solution for it?
And for our viewers and our listeners, that's what Eric's going to do for us today. But before we get into those details, you start the chapter, and one of the kind of talking about what the opponents of MMT think, and one of the really important sections in there is this idea of the noble lie. Would you like to just kind of explain that and its impact that it has on, I suppose, the conventional wisdom, but also on anyone who's trying to bring a more focus on the alternative to this kind of this noble lie?
Yeah, so that's the same thing. You can basically back all the way to Plato, okay? And the idea is that we need to tell a lie to the population, but for its own good. Okay, because if we don't tell that lie, then there will be societal chaos, and we will not be able to organize society in a coherent way. So when applied to budget finance, so fiscal government finances, what the lie is that we need to balance the budget either every year or every other year. So if one year we have a deficit, the next year we need to a surplus, so that across the 2 years we have a balanced budget. Okay, and so that's basically the lie. Okay, and the idea is that if we don't do that, then what's going to happen is we're going to have financial instability. We're going to have basically chaos in the budgetary process.
Yeah. So the mainstream is aware of effectively the kind of one of the core MMT tenets is that taxation and borrowing isn't needed to fund government expenditure, but they're happy to say that for the greater good, the belief that it'll help secure a kind of functioning government. And that's where we start in your chapter. That's where we kind of start and say, well, okay, so how do we reframe that? And what are the dangers with taking that narrative forward? It's as much a kind of institutional analysis as a post-Keynesian. We're looking at these institutions in detail and showing how they work. And that's what I think allows you to be kind of undeniably true as much as you can in any field of economics. So you talk about 3 main points that come out of this kind of institutional analysis. Could we go through these individually? So the first one you kind of state is that finance is not scarce if spent on domestically produced goods, and then we'll go through the other 2.
The idea of, again, the noble lie is that there is a scarce spot of saving, or there's a scarce spot of funds that is basically there, and the government has to compete with the private sector for that pot of fund. And so if the government competes too much, that's going to raise interest rates and create problems for the private sector to stimulate, to basically engage in economic activity. And so that will lower economic growth. What we are saying with MMT is no, the finance does not depend on a scarce pot of savings out there. Okay. Finance is a flexible that can be created on demand. And that's true not only for the government, but also for the private sector. Banks basically are monetary creator too. Okay, and they face constraints that are different from government, but they don't face a constraint in terms of a limited pool of funds that they can draw upon and lend to people. That's not how banks operate. For the government, it's the same thing. Okay, the government has monetary sovereignty, so it issues its own currency, and so it can always find the money to buy things that are priced in the unit of account of that used by the government. Domestic goods, or that can be broader, even if there is a foreign demand for the government currency, people abroad will price goods and services in the domestic currency of the foreign government. Like the US government can buy things abroad more easily because people are selling those things in US dollars.
It's kind of combining the first two to cover that. So thank you. And then the third one was that monetary sovereign governments are not like households. And this is just not a good reference point. So would you like to give us a wee bit more detail on that one?
Households are users of the currency. Government are issuer of the currency. So households can run out of money. They can face bankruptcy, insolvency, liquidity problems because they can run out of money. So government can't, as long as its obligations are denominated in the national currency. US government can make all payments that are due as they come due. Okay, Social Security payments can all be made despite all the craziness about Social Security going insolvent. We're gonna run out of money. No, okay, we can find the money. So the issue with Social Security is not an issue of finding the money because we create the money, we create the dollar as a government. That's the key difference. Once you understand the difference between issuer of the currency and user of the currency, from there you can really understand that financial constraints don't apply to an issuer of the currency. They do apply to the users, but not to the issuer.
Yeah, I definitely think that is at least half the battle when you understand that relationship. And in Scotland, there's a confusion, and I'm sure there is in the States when you're thinking about federal government and local government, because no one really understands that it's the UK government that's the currency issuer and the Scottish government is the currency user. And maybe people can see the distinction between government and household, but they're not seeing the distinction between currency issuer and currency user. And that's the most important point, isn't it? There's different types of government, but there's only one part of government that's issuing the currency, and that allows it to have so much more power and authority and agency than any other user, like a household, a business, or another form of government.
Exactly.
Great. Okay, so that's fantastic, bringing this all together. And you can see in the paper, and I'll quote here, you say that government spending and tax policy ought to be set and are dependently without regard to impact of the fiscal position, but rather with regard to the impact of the domestic economy, including inflation. What's the policy implications that come from that understanding? If finance isn't scarce, if there is a difference between an issuer and a user, what types of policies kind of naturally evolve from that?
So that changes your optic because, and that more than the optic, that's also changing the relevance of financial outcomes, because now you don't frame your policies and your discussions surrounding these policies in terms of how we're going to pay for it, meaning how are we going to balance the budget. So let's say you want to do a policy that feed all the poor children a meal every day, okay, and that's going to cost $100 million for the year. Currently, the way this policy proposal would be discussed is the first question: how are you going to pay for it? Means how are you going to find the money? And the Congressional Budget Office is going to look at the project and basically judge it strictly from the viewpoint of, will it increase the public debt? Okay, that is, will it generate a deficit? Okay. And the only way such a proposal would pass Congress if it is paid for, okay, at least would be even put on the floor. Now pass, that's not sure, but at least put on the floor for a vote.
For the audience means that you would say that we're going to borrow to pay for this, or we're going to tax to pay for this.
That's right. And so and preferably we want a tax. Okay, we don't want to actually, if you end up having to borrow, emit public debt, that's not a good thing. You want actually to pay for it by taxation or reducing spending somewhere else so that overall your budget stays balanced. Okay, so the key metric you look at to decide if a proposal is sound is, will it generate a fiscal deficit or not, or is it paid for through taxation? And what we're saying is that no, this way of looking at the proposal is incorrect. Okay, there are several reasons for that. The first one is, if you look at this fear of deficits, where does it come from? Well, it comes from the idea that fiscal deficits raise interest rates. Well, if you look at the data, there is no relation between fiscal deficits and interest rate. Interest rates are driven by monetary policy, not fiscal balance. It's also the fear that in the future, the public debt will have to be repaid by our grandchildren, and so they will have to pay higher taxes. Well, if that was true, today we'd face much higher taxes than in the past, because we are the great-grandchildren of our previous ancestors, and they have increased the public debt tremendously. No, we will never repay the public debt. A third issue, and there is no reason to, public debt plays an important public purpose, so we want to keep it. The third reason is that, if we keep borrowing money, and then the share of interest payment in the budget will balloon, and there won't be any money left for any other things. So we want to make sure that every additional spending we do is matched by more taxation, so we don't need to borrow money. And again, if you look at the data of the share of interest payment in government spending, there is no relation between that and the size of the public debt, which has been basically growing exponentially, nor with the size of the public debt relative to GDP. Okay, what drives that share is interest rates, and they're uncorrelated to fiscal deficits. They're driven by monetary policy.
And they are a policy choice, the interest rates.
That's right. So that's a policy choice. And it's also driven by the size of government spending. So the Congress can always appropriate more funds for whatever it wants to spend on. So the classic case, of course, is World War II, where you have a huge increase in the public debt relative to GDP, and the share of interest payment in the budget falls to historical low because the government decided to spend way more on the war. We had the same thing during COVID. Yeah. And so there are, you can go through several reasons why this fiscal deficit optic is incorrect. It comes from fear that the deficit does bad thing. Okay. And we're going to run out of money and all those. And really, it doesn't. Okay. If you look carefully at the data, it doesn't. If you look at the institutional practices between the central bank and the treasury, you can see that they coordinate their activities so that we can always find the money. Leave aside this idea that if we have a proposal, we're going to have to look, does that create a deficit? Who cares? It might lead to a fiscal surplus. It might lead to a fiscal deficit or balanced budget. That's not the relevant metric to judge the proposal. What you're going to judge the proposal on is, does it achieve the outcome you want to achieve? So in our cases, will $100 million be enough to feed all the kids? Do we have enough food to feed these kids or not? Okay, maybe we don't. Okay, and so that's how you're gonna frame. So if we don't have enough food, we're gonna have to reduce the size of the proposal. Maybe we can only do $50 million, and that's how you're gonna judge the proposal. Okay, in terms of, do we have the resource, and does it fulfill what it wants to do? Maybe 100 million is not enough for the calorie intakes needed by kids. Maybe we need to increase that to 200 million. Okay, and then the question is, do we have enough food to spend for that purpose? If yes, do it. If we don't, well, we would like to, but we can't.
This is a hugely important point that you're making, is that currently, you've got the Congressional Budget Office in the States. We have which I refer to as the Office for Austerity in the UK, and it's judging everything simply on whether or not it's adding to the deficit, and it's not looking at the kind of efficacy of these proposals, the justice inherent in every economic decision. And you kind of covered how you can look at that differently. There's also an element of, you're spending this money, will it increase inflation? And you're looking at your kind of scorecard for these proposals. And I just thought this was just an incredibly kind of refreshing way to look at policies. And I think most people would say, what makes more sense? Does it add to the budget as the reason to do it, or does it achieve what you want to achieve? Are the resources available, and does it have any kind of meaningful impact or negative impact on the economy? And it's so clear that the best way for an economy to do this is to take this kind of multi-scorecard approach, and you can only really see that when you realize that you aren't having to try and find the money from somewhere else. So, I think a new role for these budget offices kind of comes out really clearly from that.
And there's another point. Even balancing the budget may not allow you to do what you want to do. So, for example, let's say we decide to have a policy that says that we're going to buy a house for everyone. We're going to give $1 million to everyone in the United States to buy a house. Okay, maybe it's too big of a house. Let's do $200,000 for most people. That's good enough. Okay, $200,000 to everyone so they can buy a house. Okay, don't need to take a mortgage. You just buy a house like this. Okay, and we say we're gonna pay for this by taxing the wealthy proportion, the wealthy people. Okay, all right. Well. And so we have a paid for proposal according to the logic of sound finance. And so this should roll through easily. Well, from the point of view of MMT, this is highly problematic because you are not looking at the proper criteria to see if that policy is sound. What you have to figure out is, well, hold it. Do we have enough lumber? Do we have enough material basically to make these houses? Okay, I think from the point of view of MMT, such rolling out policy carelessly like that is basically a bait and switch type of policy. Okay, it's not going to be doable even though you have balanced the budget. Okay, that's not, and so that's where these metrics of just caring about balancing the budget and framing your policies in terms of, we're going to be insolvent because we didn't balance and so we can't do it, or we have balanced the budget so we can do it, are the incorrect way to look at the problems. And that's true for housing, for aging society, for the environment, for all those policies, basically.
Yeah, and I agree completely. And another thing that I thought was really important in your chapter was when you were saying, well, actually, if you frame this that we need the wealthy to pay for these things in a society, then I think you said you're kind of endangering democracy. And if the government's seen as this kind of Robin Hood role where it is stealing from the wealthy to give to the poor, then that can kind of undermine a democratic process as well.
I think I come from the United States, where money plays a huge role in politics, and basically there is a straight 1-to-1 correlation between the amount of money that a politician obtains in a campaign and its probability of being elected. So this idea of the role of money and its influence on political outcomes is really highly present in the United States. And so, yes, and so that generates a highly undemocratic society where the wealthier segments of the population has basically much higher capacity to influence the policy agenda and frame discussions and to skew policy toward its own interests. And so by using we need to tax the rich to pay for things, we basically reinforce that narrative and reinforce the power of the rich, okay? And basically we tie our own end to their own interests, basically. And so that makes for a far less democratic society. And there are plenty of studies that look at that, okay? That look at what is the probability of a policy passing with the percentage of the population that approves it. And for the general populations, there's basically no relation between the percentage of people who agrees with the policy and its probability for it of passing. Whereas if the higher, the wealthiest have an agreement, are more in agreement with the policy, that has a much higher chance of passing.
Could you just explain briefly, using this kind of MMT lens, how we viewed the Second World War and what happened and how we viewed the COVID experience?
Going back to World War II first. So there what we had is federal spending, okay, went from about 10% of GDP before the war to about 40% in 2 years, okay, 45%. So we quadruple the size of government spending in the economy in about 2 years, okay? And that doesn't lead to huge inflation, okay? And how did we achieve that? And it didn't lead to ballooning interest payments on the public debt that eat up all the budget. It did lead to a huge increase in the public debt, okay? So how did we do that? Well, first of all, we had the help of the Federal Reserve, which is not something exceptional, okay? This occurs on a routine basis. Okay? The Fed always helps the Treasury to find money. And so this idea that you have independence of the Fed in the sense that the Fed doesn't care about the Treasury's need is incorrect. Okay, it has independence of monetary policy making, but it always helps the Treasury. But that was an essential component at the time. In addition to the main problem for governments, finding the money was not the problem. The problem was find a way to reallocate resources away from private use toward public use, because increasing government spending that much required sacrifice on the private side because we could not grow the pie quickly enough, okay, to basically increase the share of government spending quickly by producing more quickly. Okay, we had to basically take away from the private sector into the government sector. So what did we do? Well, we retooled car production factories, okay, and we made them produce tanks. We had a lot of men that were going on the front, and so with that means a lot of white women had to be trained to work in heavy industry and to become engineers. For Black women at the time, they were already heavily involved in the labor market. But white women tended to be homemakers, basically. And if you look at women's magazine at the time prior to the war, it's about the woman measuring with a ruler the distance between the plate and the fork and making sure it's perfect. You have a table that is perfectly set. During the war, that changes. We see a woman doing a technical drawing to make planes, okay? And so you have to basically move a lot of people out of their houses into training them for building tanks, planes, and you want to look at both the production, but also the engineering. So you need to train people on that. And so that's what we did there. We also put in place price controls and wage controls. We incentivize savings. So we worked both on the supply side to try to basically do with the resources we have in terms of labor and capital and move that toward the war effort. And we also worked on the demand side by restricting wage earnings so that you limit spending, putting price controls and things like that. Yes.
Yeah. And there was also the war bonds as well, wasn't there? And again, coming back to the idea of the noble lie, it might have been easier to say to people, you're paying for the war effort, than it was to say to them, don't spend at the moment because the inflation will cause huge problems. And you can see that argument was made quite successfully then. So those are principles of MMT that said that the government can rank up spending if it wants, and it's not inflationary depending on all these other things.
Add one more thing though, the idea that I think when people hear the idea that the government cannot run out of money, they immediately jump to the conclusion, oh, well, then we can increase. That means we're going to increase government spending a lot. Okay. And why? Yeah. Okay. No, there is no relation between the fact that we cannot run out of money and the idea that we will spend more. That depends on the public purpose. Do we want more government involvement in the economy? I think if you look at the experiences of a lot of countries, that's not the case. Okay, a lot of countries do not want, for a variety of reasons, major involvement. Even though they have monetary sovereignty, they could. Okay, they can't run out of money, but they don't want to do it because they have a view that the government should have a limited role in the economy. Others want more. That's fine. Okay, Europe, it's 50% of GDP. Japan is 20%. Okay, others is more or less. There is a discussion, but it's a political discussion about what you want the government to do for you. And so this idea that, because now we have free reign in terms of finance, we're going to spend like crazy is not true.
Okay? Yeah. Back to World War II, what we're seeing is that all the evidence is that an increase in government spending doesn't cause inflation. We can do that. We can completely change how the economy functions, and we can achieve societal goals and not worry about government deficits. So getting back to COVID, same lessons from COVID or anything different?
Okay, so for COVID, I think we were basically taken by surprise. Okay, and my viewpoint is, so first of all, we spent about $5 trillion in 2 years? Okay, a huge increase in government spending, massive, historically unheard of. Okay, and throughout that spending, we never heard people asking, where are we going to find the money? Hold it, we need to balance the budget. Okay. You propose to buy masks for everyone. Well, hold it. First of all, how are we going to pay for it? Okay. We can't balance the budget. Sorry, we won't do it. We want to develop vaccines for the populations and distribute it. Okay, that's going to cost $500 billion. That's your proposal. How are you going to pay for it? You didn't find the taxes? We don't do it. We just forget it. So we're just going to cross our hands and wait for it to play out. We won't make masks. We won't develop vaccines. We won't provide any financial helps to anyone because all the proposals that have come on the table are not finding the pay fors. Okay, no. If we had followed that logic, which is the sound finance logic, huge increase in death. Massive financial misery everywhere in the nation. Okay,
and financial instability as well, of course.
Of course, businesses closing left and right, huge unemployment, people are in desperate situations, and the playbook is that okay, fine, we will let it play out, and that's actually the mentality of the early Hoover administration. Okay, these advisors were really didn't want the government to go in deficits because they thought that this would create even worse outcome by the traditional story crowd out investment by raising interest rates and all this. And the philosophy was his Secretary of State, I think, said that we need to let it play out. We need to let the rottenness being purged out of the system.
Yeah.
So liquidate farmers, liquidate workers, liquidate businesses. It will purge selectively those who made bad decisions. And so we could, that's one way to do it, I guess. But that's not what is probably best for society. And so decided to leave that framing aside. Okay, and we do it any time of emergencies, wars, or we say, okay, forget it. We'll just do what we need to do. Okay, and so we spent $5 trillion. Now the question becomes: was that $5 trillion spent wisely? There we can have some discussions. I know for my part, for example, I received financial help during COVID, even though I was employed and my situation was not, I had no problem, but I still received extra money. I probably should not have received those funds. So we could have been more careful if we make a ex post argument. Okay, we could have been more careful and allocated. Now, if you go in at the time of the action with emergencies, where it's hard to figure out who is having trouble and all this, there we made do basically. And we'll let it go. So in case of emergencies like that, when it's hard to plan more carefully, you have to do what you had to do. But ideally, when you have a proposal that is about looking long term, like environment, like aging, you have much more time to think ahead and to plan ahead and to think carefully about where we want to spend, how much can we spend. There we have, I think, a much sounder basis of decision-making process. And so COVID showed you basically that finding the money is not a problem. Finding the money and spending was hugely helpful for the economy in terms of helping stabilize things. Okay. Now we had some inflation in part because, well, we gave money left and right, but that's not the only source. Okay. At least 50% of inflation here is not related at all to the demand side. Okay. You have oil price pressures, you have supply chain breaking down and shipping costs quadrupling. You have all kinds of supply side factors that come into play and contributed to inflation too. And you have, of course, price gouging also that was in the news, okay, where companies took the time of confusion regarding inflation to basically raise their markups. Okay, so those are another form of inflation that came in too.
So I think so many lessons for us to learn from those two. Do you think we are younger academics within MMT and a lot of activists are moving towards a prescriptive role for MMT? And if so, what do you think, kind of summarizing, is those likely policies?
I think they were always there. I think ultimately the message was always make your policies differently than on the basis of sound finance. The paper is trying to spell that out a bit more, but you'll find it in Kelton Deficit Myth book too, okay, for example, and along with Randy's primer on MMT. It's all there, basically. And so, the main point is to look at government spending and taxes in a different way, back to Abba Lerner, even functional finance, okay, instead of sound finance. Okay, what you care about is what is the economic effects of the tax or spending proposal you want to make. So an example I take in the article, okay, is, let's say we want to have a tax policy to reduce inequality. Okay, well, the first question of order is not, oh, how much money this is going to raise, and will that help us to feed the poor kids that we were talking about before, which is actually the way Elizabeth Warren frames that type of policy. She has a wealth tax she wants to put in place with the argument that this is to reduce wealth inequality in that case, okay, and that this policy is good because it will raise hundreds of millions of dollars that we can use to do other things. Okay, well, hold it. The point was to reduce wealth inequality, well, not to raise money. So if you think of it this way, the way you judge a tax policy here is, first of all, you have to decide, what does it mean to reduce wealth inequality? Okay, are we talking about changing the Gini coefficient? By how much? Okay, are we talking about quartile distributions? Okay, how are we going to skew this? Okay, you have to define properly what you mean by that. And let's say we want to reduce the share of wealth owned by the top 20% from, in the United States, about 80% of the wealth of the nation is held by the top 20%. We want to reduce that to 50%. Okay, so we want a 30 percentage point decline in the share of the wealth held by the top 20%. Okay, so now we have some numbers to work with that is more concrete than just reducing inequality. Okay, so, and we want to do that, we decide to do that by taxation. Okay, we could do it other ways, but we decided to do that through taxation. So now the question becomes is, how much do you have to tax the wealth to achieve that? Okay, if we follow Elizabeth Warren, we need, I think it's 3% or something like that. It's a small tax on wealth. Okay, is that enough to reduce the share of wealth by 30 percentage points? Well, we can do an econometric analysis and see if it does. Okay, if it does, fine, cool, then we're good. If it does more, then 3% is too much. Maybe 2% is enough, or 1%. If it's not enough, we might have to increase that to 10% or 20% or more. Okay, and so that's how you're going to judge if your policy is effective. Does it achieve its goal, which the goal here is reduce inequality by 30 percentage points. Okay, that's what you want to do.
Yeah.
Now, so, will that raise money? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe if wealthy people are good at evading this taxation, it might not basically generate any funds. Okay, but if it's able to change the way they spend their money, in terms of where they put their money, maybe they're going to be incentivized to give away more money to private charities. So that gives another way to reduce inequalities. Okay, the point is that we could spend more time on it, but the point is you're not going to judge the efficacy of that policy in terms of, does it raise $1 trillion that we can use for other things? Okay, you use it in terms of decreasing inequality.
Okay, but what policies does MMT want to support actively? So rather than just saying you can do this, where are we in terms of the policy?
Well, we have take the Green New Deal. That's something we actively supported. And the way we frame the proposal is not in terms of how many trillions of dollars it's going to cost. which is what the enemies of that policy said. They say it's going to cost $93 trillion. Unaffordable. We can't do it. Okay. What we looked at instead is, and that's back in 2020-ish. Okay. We say, given where we are now, and given the policy, the 1% plus 1.5% degree Celsius increase, we want to try to target. How much resources do we need to allocate in terms of GDP percentage every year for the next 10 years to achieve that? Okay. Well, it turns out that at least the Green New Deal by itself is quite a small percentage of GDP. It's about, 5% growth in growth terms. It's a very small amount. Okay. So that's how you're going to judge the policy. So Green New Deal is one. Okay. Job guarantee is, of course, a staple policy proposal of the MMT framework. Okay, the idea is that leaving people unemployed is creating huge cost, both individually and for society. It's linked to crimes, drug use, violence, and basically huge enforcement in terms of money is wasted for policing all those stuff. So it's much better to keep people employed. It's much less costly. It increases the probability of being rehired. It trains people in things we need. So that's another main proposal. And it's again, we judge that policy in terms of its impact on the resources it needs from the economy. And it's a small program because there are a large number of unemployed, but relative to the size of the economy, they're a small amount. Okay, it's quite far cheaper in terms of drains of resources, okay, than universal basic income, where you pay everyone. Here we are only focusing on the unemployed, and we also have benefits from that because we retrain them, we make them better able to re-enter the labor force, and so there is a supply side benefit that comes from there too. So those are two policies.
Yeah, and I think those are fairly concrete policies, but I think we're into the space now, and and I'll quote you here. But you say most MMT proponents back the recommendations of the United Nations report that promotes a policy agenda set on democratic decision making, full employment policies, social protection for the vulnerable, an effective justice system, gender and racial equality, respect for human dignity, responsible fiscal policies, and environmental justice. I mean, if that's where we're able to kind of start building our policy framework from, that's a really positive position to be in, to say MMT has moved or is taking this descriptive element and it is more prescriptive. And that's where I think that a lot of the activists, certainly that I know, and the younger academics like yourself and Durkens, really want to see the discipline going. And I think you've given a really good foundation for that. But you often hear people saying, no, you can't do MMT. MMT is a description. And I've been saying to people, well, actually you can. And a lot of MMT academics are pushing towards that you can do MMT. That's my final question. If someone says to you, you can't do MMT, what's your comeback?
If you look at the finance side, we're already doing MMT. Because as we say, it's a description. So the financial praxis, that is the way government functions today, is following MMT, because MMT is just exposing that basically to the public, looking at the fact that the central bank and the treasury work together on a routine basis. Monetary financing occurs all the time, either directly or indirectly. It's not something that is inherently leads to instability. So finding the money, not a problem. We are doing already MMT from that perspective. Where we're not doing MMT is on the policy making side. And that's where a lot of the work needs to be done. It's moving away from the fiscal austerity mindset that we must balance the budget, and so there is a lot of work to do. We're not doing MMT now.
Thank you very much. Best of luck with everything that's coming up, and I hope we get some good news from where you are in the next few days. Enjoy Washington when you get there.
We'll try. We'll see. All right, then. Thanks.